welcome to the first event in this year's Humanities Lecture Series. I'm Sally Utek, Acting Director of the Hall Center, which organizes this event. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like to offer support to ensure our public programs thrive, I would like to make you aware of the Friends of the Hall Center brochure in your program. Each year, the Friends provide crucial funding for the center, 100% of which goes directly towards supporting programming. If you have any questions, please talk to any Hall Center staff member or any of the many friends who are in our audience tonight. It's our great pleasure this evening to bring you Alice Dreger, an award-winning scholar, historian of medicine and science, sex researcher, and public intellectual. Her latest major publication, Galileo's Middle Finger, was funded by a Guggenheim Fellowship and published last year. It has received mounds of critical praise. The Chronicle of Higher Education has characterized Alice as reliably funny, so tonight's talk will be both informative and lively. Our guests will take questions after her talk, if you would make your way to one of the two microphones in the aisles. Afterwards, in the app space behind me, there will be a reception where Alice will sign copies of her book, so please stay for that. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. in the Hall Center, Alice will answer any and all of your questions during a conversation moderated by Marta Vicente, Associate Professor of History. These morning events are interactive and enjoyable occasions, and I encourage you to attend. I've asked Katie Batza to introduce tonight's speaker. Katie earned her doctorate in U.S. history from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2011, along with a graduate concentration in work, race, gender, and the urban world, and a graduate certificate in gender and women's studies. Her research investigates the intersection of sexuality, health, and politics in the late 20th century United States. Her first book, soon to be published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, entitled Before AIDS, explores gay healthcare activism in the period before the AIDS crisis. She has already begun a second book project that explores the experiences of the early AIDS crisis in the heartland, with particular interest in how people with AIDS and their allies enacted and deployed claims of citizenship in response to the health crisis. She has played an active role in the National Park Service's LGBTQ initiative, contributing a chapter to the National Park Service's LGBTQ theme study, and co-founding a nonprofit, Rainbow Heritage Network, that aids in identifying, preserving, and interpreting historic sites of particular meaning to the LGBTQ communities. Katie serves as the Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department, and she co-chairs the University Sexuality and Gender Diversity Consortium. So please welcome Katie.
Thank you all. This evening we have the pleasure of hosting Alice Draeger, who found a witty and incisive way to capture the controversial and conflicted space that scholars and activists often find themselves inhabiting when she titled her most recent book, Galileo's Middle Finger, Heretics, Activists, and One Scholar's Search for Justice. The book's first-person accounting argues that ethics necessitates the search for evidence, that science and social justice require each other to be healthy. She asks us to understand what happens and to figure out what should happen when activists and scholars find themselves in conflict over critical matters of human identity. Though many of us who identify as both scholars and activists are familiar with these moments when our hearts don't agree with our evidence, Dreger brings our sometimes excruciating internal conflicts into the open and into scholarly debate with humor and vulnerability rarely found in academic writing. I'm far from the only one who appreciates her for having done so, as the book, which was funded by a Guggenheim Fellowship, has earned rave reviews from the New York Times, the New Yorker, Science, Nature, Forbes, to name but a few. The daughter of a devout Catholic Polish immigrants that identified as both feminists and anti-abortion activists and who valued critical thinking and independent thinking, it seems that perhaps in some ways Draeger's path to writing this book on the messiness of justice and evidence started at birth. However, her scholarly career really gained attention when she completed her graduate work in the history of philosophy of science from Indiana University, where she won the support of a Woodrow Wilson Foundation. She has since epitomized public intellectual engagement by publishing widely in both top-tier scholarly journals as well as in the national mainstream press. She has also instigated and embodied the activist scholar conundrum as patient advocate for children born with norm-challenging body types, as the founding board chair of the Intersex Society for North America, as the mom who live tweeted her son's high school sex ed class and thus sparking an international discussion of abstinence-based sex education. Her work has won her numerous accolades, awards, guest appearances, keynote addresses, and a TEDx lecture. Please join me in welcoming Alice Draeger.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. You know, one of the really enjoyable things for me about traveling around the country talking about academic freedom is that it gives me an opportunity to look at the work of the people I'm visiting with, and it's just amazing the work that's going on at the Hall Center here. Katie's work, I'm sure people at dinner wanted to talk to me, but I wanted to talk to her all about her work because it's so incredibly interesting. So it's such a privilege to be with you all, and thank you for coming out in the rain. Although I'm been in Michigan for 20 years, so I can kind of relate to the feeling in Kansas, which is if you wait for the weather to get good, you'll never go anywhere. I don't know if that's true in Kansas. It's certainly true in Michigan. When Michigan was changing over its state slogan, I suggested it should be "Come for the weather, stay for the food," both of which were sarcastic. But the weather's gotten better thanks to climate change, and the food has gotten better thanks to the farm-to-table movement. So Katie's introduction just reminded me, I'll tell you, people often wonder how I could have come from a conservative Catholic family, and my sister, who actually looks a lot like me, except for some reason she has gray hair, I don't know why. She is actually a conservative Catholic Dominican nun and also a physician. And she actually went to medical school after becoming a nun. So I'm an atheist sex researcher, and my sister is a Dominican physician. And one day we were sitting on the couch, and my mother looked at the two of us. This was a couple years ago, and my sister was wearing, her full habit with her big rosary, and I was wearing something with cleavage. And my mother looked at us and said, "My daughter the nun and my daughter the sex researcher. How did this happen?" And I said, "Well, you raised one of us, right?" And then I said to my mother, "Would you like a gin and tonic?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "See?" But actually, what I want to talk with you about today does come out of that background, in the sense that I want to talk to you about where we are in America today, where America came from, and the kinds of values that our parents really instilled in us, which was very much the value of using our rights in America, and the importance of searching for two things, one of which was searching for truth, and the other searching for justice. This book that I've written, Galileo, is in many ways a tribute to my parents' view of the world as immigrants. And it's amazing to me how often people who are immigrants or children of immigrants relate to this book. Because I think it's easy, if you grew up in a family that was American for many generations back, not to realize how extraordinary America is in terms of its amazing ability to progress forward with rights and its ability to capture democracy. So I want to talk about these twin goals that have existed in the United States from the very start. What a lot of people don't know is that the founding fathers were actually, many of them were science geeks. And the approach that they were taking to democracy was very much the same approach as was being birthed in science at that time. It was the idea that many minds together could figure out what is true. That you should have a voting system not based on who happened to be born into power, but rather bring together intelligent people to try to figure out who should govern. And in the same way, they were very interested in the sciences in terms of understanding how we could bring multiple minds together to figure out what was true in astronomy, what was true in chemistry, what was true in the natural world. The problem today, as I'm going to talk about, is we've got a system in the United States where increasingly the truth for justice and the search for truth and the search for justice are at odds with each other. That there are battles going on between people who are seeking one or the other. And what I want to try to convince you of today is that you can't actually have justice without truth, and you can't really do the search for truth without justice. So that instead of having the kinds of wars that we see going on, particularly in social media today, we need to really think about how to take care of both of those things, particularly within the academy, because the academy is pretty much the last place in the world where you can do the kinds of work that has to be done to keep democracy moving forward. That's not to say it can never be done outside the academy, but if we protect the academy, if we take back the academy from the kinds of forces that are currently harming it, we have the potential to be a place where we incubate democracy, where we make it possible to not only go forward in terms of political rights, but also go forward in terms of having enough evidence to know what's going to work in terms of social policy. Because social policy built on fantasy is not sustainable. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I came from in terms of my own intellectual work. I My dirty little secret is I actually dropped out of college and became a mortgage broker for 5 years because I was sick and tired of people telling me what to read and what to think. And back in those days, university learning was largely passive learning. So I became a mortgage broker in New York, and I ended up going to a therapist to try to heal my wounded head. And he said to me at one point, "You're cured, get out of New York." So I had found out that my advisor could get me into the program in History and Philosophy of Science at Indiana University, and I didn't know where Indiana was because I was a New Yorker. I actually, I took a napkin and carried it around and asked people from New York to tell me where they thought Indiana was, and it was like that New Yorker cartoon, right? It ended up in New Jersey, Kansas, in fact, Hawaii, but luckily AAA knew where Indiana was. So I went to graduate school in Indiana. And I was interested in feminism and science. These were my two passions. And my dissertation director suggested to me that I look at the history of hermaphroditism. He was a historian of embryology, Fred Churchill, a very well-known historian of embryology among historians of science. And he said to me, "I know you're really interested in gender questions, and it seems to me that nobody's really looked at the history of hermaphrodites, and this is an interesting place to look at a question like you're interested in, the question of how do we think about categories." So I thought I would look at embryology, and I would look at Darwin's barnacles, because Charles Darwin studied barnacles that were hermaphroditic. And my dissertation director, Fred Churchill, kept saying to me, "No, no, no, look at medicine." And I kept wondering, why would I look at medicine? It doesn't happen in humans past the embryonic stage. Because I had no idea that humans could be born with sex types that were in between or blended. But I finally did look at medicine, and I started looking at the 19th century medical literature. And when I started looking, I found hundreds upon hundreds of case studies of people who had been identified as having body types that weren't the standard male or the standard female type. And I thought to myself, how on earth could it be that I'm 25 years old, a feminist, sexually active, aware of sexual health, and I've never heard of this? And it occurred to me that there must have been a real effort in the medical system to make it invisible. And so I started looking at the history of what had happened to people labeled hermaphroditic in the medical system in the 1800s going into the 1900s. And as I started to publish that work, people who had been born with the same conditions began to contact me. The internet was relatively new, but they were using it, and they started contacting me through email. And one of the first people to contact me was Beau Laurent, who at the time was going by an activist named Cheryl Chase. She had founded the Intersex Society of North America, which was known as ISNA. And she wrote to me and she asked me to help with changing the current day medical system. And my first reaction was, I do dead people, I don't do living people. You know, if somebody's still living, they're not history. And that's what I had been taught. But she said to me, well, you're a feminist, you self-identify as that, I know from your work, and so why don't you at least look at what's going on today? Now, I had only looked at the Victorian period, so I hadn't looked at the modern medical literature at all. But luckily, it was easy for me to look at it because I was shacking up with a medical student, who I later married. So it was easy for me to put my books down one day and go to his books on the other side of our tiny little living room. And I did that, and I pulled out a book that we had paid, by my recollection, $180 for, which today would be about $450. So it was an expensive, modern medical textbook. This was not an ancient book. This was in the mid-1990s. And I opened up to the section on clitoromegaly, which is when a girl has a large clitoris. So the clitoris and the penis are actually the same organ in terms of development. And so you can have an organ that's in between the penis and the clitoris. So you can be born with a large clitoris. So I opened to that section, and what this book said, modern medical textbook, was if a girl had a big clitoris, she might grow up to be a lesbian, so you had to cut off part of her clitoris so that wouldn't happen. This was the mid-1990s, right? This was not the 1920s. And I was absolutely stunned. Of course, my first reaction was to put both my hands over my crotch, right? It was a visceral reaction of, you're doing what? And also a scientific attitude of, what makes you think big clitorises cause lesbianism, and what makes you think lesbianism needs prevention through surgery? So then I opened up the section of the book on what's called hypospadias in the medical literature, and that's when the urinary opening isn't on the end of the penis, as is typical, but is on the underside, or sometimes even pretty far down near the scrotum. And what this textbook said was that if a boy could not write his name in the snow next to other little boys, he would grow up gay. So you had to do surgery on his penis to make sure he could pee out of the end of the penis so that he would not grow up gay. So my partner came home from school, from clinic, and I showed him these things, and having grown up a girl, I was fascinated. I said, did you write your name in the snow next to other little boys? And he said, no. Do you think I'm gay? But we were both kind of just, I was pretty sure he wasn't gay, by the way, but we were both pretty stunned at that these would be in modern medical textbooks. And I said to him, how could they write this stuff that's so phenomenally unscientific? It's based on a vague Freudian concept of phallic length. And Freud is not even in favor anymore. And they're doing surgery to try to engineer sexual orientation. And so I got involved in the intersex rights movement, thinking it would take only about 6 months. I thought that the way babies with intersex was being treated was so obviously outrageous that it wouldn't be very hard to change it. That was partly because part of what the medical system advocated for was withholding medical information from the people on whom you did these surgeries in infancy. The idea being that if you told them what had happened, then you would undo all the good the surgery had supposedly done. So you couldn't really tell them the full truth about what you had done to them. So, for example, boys at that time born with a condition called micropenis, which is when the penis is small, were being sex changed into girls even though they had healthy testes, and even though their brains had been subject to testosterone. Just because their penises were small, they were being sex changed into girls, having their fertility permanently taken away, having new genitals built for them in infancy, which would have to be followed up at puberty, and then lied to about what had happened to them. So it didn't take 6 months. As it turns out, the medical system is still quite entrenched. Boys born with micropenis are no longer made into girls. That said, girls born with large clitorises are still every day subjected to surgeries. And so I spent the next 20 years working with intersex activists that I still work with, trying to change the medical system. What moved me very much in this system was not just coming from the point of view of a feminist idea about sexual health and about sexual minorities and the fact that being gay and lesbian is not a disease, which the medical system technically had agreed on 20 years before that. But I was really moved by the fact that medicine seemed so phenomenally unscientific. I was coming to this as somebody who is a devotee of science, and so it struck me that this was a very non-scientific way to approach the whole thing. And when I said this to my partner, he said to me, oh, you have so much to learn about medicine. Medicine is not a science. And he used a phrase that I had never heard before. He used the phrase evidence-based medicine. And I said to him, what else is there? And he said, everything you've ever known in your entire life as a patient has probably not been based on rigorous clinical evidence for the most part. It's been based on tradition, on clinical experience, which is not the same as clinical evidence. And so one of the things I became very motivated by was trying to use intersex to move medicine, along with other people who were working on evidence-based medicine, to move medicine to a more evidence-based system. Well, I worked on this for about 10 years, and for complicated reasons, I decided to give up my tenured position at Michigan State because I had had a child. I was running the Intersex Society of North America with Bo Laurent. I was also doing mainstream writing and activism, and it was all too much. And when I made a list of what I enjoyed, a lot of what I enjoyed was not required of me at my job. And so I quit that position and moved to Northwestern University in a part-time position in the medical school there. In exchange for my name, they gave me some money, and I did a little bit of teaching, very little teaching at that time, although it grew over the years. And I thought I was retiring at that point from intersex work, and so I decided to take on a new project, a new historical project. And I won't go into huge depth because it takes up 2 chapters of my book, but basically I decided to do a history of a controversy within transgender. Now, transgender is not the same as intersex. Intersex is about being born into a body type that's physically different from standard male or standard female, that being defined by the medical system. And transgender is about identity, it's about self-identity, so it is the feeling that the gender assignment given to you at your birth is not the correct one. So I often tell people, intersex and transgender people suffer from the same root problem, but they suffer different problems. And that is the root problem of the medical system trying to say who gets to be what. So intersex people were getting surgeries they did not ask for, and transgender people often could not get the interventions they did ask for at that time, although it's gotten better over the years. So what had happened at Northwestern was that a sex researcher named Michael Bayley had published a book called The Man Who Would Be Queen, the subtitle which is about looking at the science of gender bending. And in that book, he looked at a particular concept brought by the sex researcher Ray Blanchard from Toronto. And this was the idea that among people who transition from male to female, there are 2 basic types. One type being people who begin life as very femme little boys and end up being attracted to other males, and they transition to become straight women. The other type being what Blanchard called autogynephilia, namely having a more male childhood, and being aroused by the idea of being or becoming a woman, and sometimes transitioning because that helped with the sexual orientation. I know it's a lot to wrap your head around because it's not a commonly talked about concept, but the danger of Bayley putting this concept out politically was that over the years, transgender activists had, for very good reason, desexualized transgender. They had talked about gender and not sexuality because the straight people in power didn't want to hear about sexuality where transgender was concerned. That made it kinky and weird and fetishistic, but as long as we talked about gender, we were allowed to talk about it. So transgender people got the message over the years that talking about their sexuality was just going to cause them problems and they should talk about gender instead. But Bayley thought that this was a way of sort of not talking about the truth about transgender, and so in his book he talked about Blanchard's concept and brought forth some of the science for it, although it was a popularized book. What happened to him was that a group of transgender activists came after him, and came after him hard in 2003 when his book was published. And they levied a whole host of charges against him, including that he had made up research, that he had used people in experiments without their knowledge and without IRB approval, so Institutional Review Board approval, that he had had sex with a transsexual woman when she was his research subject, that he'd been practicing clinical psychology without a license. These were all career-damning claims. I had mostly stayed out of it in 2003. I had friends on both sides of this battle because I was working with transgender people in terms of doing intersex rights work. They were often our allies, and I was also working with sex researchers, some of whom were friends of Bayley. But in 2006, as I thought I was retiring from intersex work, I found this story really interesting. And one of the people who had gone after Bayley was invited to Northwestern. And when I looked up what she had done, I wrote to the Northwestern group that had invited her and said, I didn't suggest they disinvite her, but I didn't think she was a particularly good representative of transgender rights or somebody to bring to an academic campus. She had taken pictures of Bayley's kids and put black bars over their eyes and put up satire pieces about them on the internet suggesting that they had been sodomized by their father. Going after people's kids is one of the things that you're not supposed to do. Battling with a researcher is one thing, going after their children is another. And so when I blogged about how I thought that this particular individual named Andrea James should not be somebody that we should be welcoming onto a campus, she came after me. And so I became fascinated because I'm stupid. When I find something where nothing seems to be like the way I would expect it to be, I'm like, let's look at that. You know, most people have the good sense to go, I'm getting out of here, right? But when I come up with a situation where everything seems to be upside down, I become deeply fascinated. So I spent the next year researching what had happened to Bayley. And I ended up using about 1,000 written and recorded sources in terms of video and audio. I interviewed about 100 people. And I thought it was going to be a he said, she said story. I thought what was going to happen was that there was going to be a misunderstanding where Bayley was just a white heterosexual male political clod who didn't understand that the language that he was using was offensive, and that the people who he had offended were going to be a little over the top, but no. In fact, what I found was that in fact all of the charges against Bayley were false, and that the people making the charges against him probably knew that they were all false. That these were trumped up charges designed to kill the messenger of a message they didn't want getting out into the public. Why didn't they want the message out into the public? Because they were afraid Bayley putting forth Blanchard's ideas was going to paint them as fetishistic and roll back their rights. And so they went after Bayley really, really hard. So I knew that when I went to go publish this work that they were probably going to come after me harder. I had, after all, literally written the book on what they had done to him. But I decided I had to publish it anyway. So I did do that, and they did come after me very hard. And this was in 2007. At the time, Google's algorithms were easier to manipulate. And what ended up happening was they took advantage of those abilities to manipulate Google's algorithms. And over the course of about 1 week, my reputation online changed from being somebody who was an internationally recognized scholar, a champion of intersex rights, an ally to the LGBT rights movement, to being somebody who wanted to put intersex people in the gas chambers, somebody who was an enemy of the LGBT rights movement, somebody who was a tool of the Catholic Church. They went after my parents and my sister. I was very much afraid they were going to come after my son. At one point, I should tell you, in the piece I published about what had happened to Bayley, I engaged this question of whether or not it's ever appropriate to have sex with somebody who is a research subject. And in there, I made a joke, because I joke around in my work a lot to relieve the tension. And one of the things I said was that if everybody you write about is a research subject, and you're never supposed to have sex with a research subject, then I had broken that rule multiple times because I frequently wrote about my husband without his permission. And so it was a joke in the piece, but rather than referring to the joke, an ethics charge was filed against me as being somebody who promoted sex with research subjects. And then the school paper at Northwestern decided to cover the story, which I begged them not to because it was just going to feed more hot air into this explosion. But they did cover it, and when they did, my husband posted a comment, joke. He said, "I am the subject of both the sex and the research, and I must say both are excellent." This resulted in an ethics charge being filed against him at his university. I'm pretty sure we're the only couple in history to be accused of ethics violations for having slept with each other. But it got crazy. I have to tell you, it got crazy. I was scared for my security. I was particularly scared for my son, not because I thought the main people coming after me were going to do violence, but because they were whipping into a frenzy people who were convinced that I was the enemy. And you know how easy it is to get guns in America. I don't have to explain to you how easy it is to get guns in America. So this was kind of a terrifying experience and a very disorienting one. And I had a lot of my friends in the intersex rights movement ask me if they should defend my reputation. And I had to keep telling them, I don't think that we should be spending time on this. I think you need to keep your eyes on the prize and work on intersex rights and just ignore this. But that did mean that I had to do all of my own self-defense for the most part. And it was exhausting and demoralizing and stressful, particularly because I'd given up a tenured job and was now working a part-time job, and they were coming after my reputation. So Steve Pinker at Harvard was one of the people who read the piece that I wrote, and he thought it was great, and he asked me if I would like an introduction to his agent. I said, I really need to rescue my scholarly reputation, so will you help me get a Guggenheim Fellowship? So he was one of my recommenders for the Guggenheim Fellowship. One of the other ones, by the way, was the sex columnist Dan Savage. I like that I got a Guggenheim recommendation from Steve Pinker and Dan Savage put together. And I was given the Guggenheim, and my project was to go out and interview other researchers who had experienced something similar. These were researchers who were not on the right wing, as we had all been accused of being, who tended to be actually well left of the political center, but who had been come after by identity politics mobs who had decided that the message that they were putting out was too dangerous to have out in the wilderness. And so you can see why the book is called Galileo's Middle Finger. I was very much, as a historian of science, motivated and centered on the idea of Galileo having been essentially somebody who challenged identity politics. When Galileo turned his telescopes to the sky, he was in fact looking at the stars, but he was also doing something more. He was looking at the question of what humans are and who has the right to say what is true about the world. He was challenging the Catholic Church's power in terms of the identity politics of the day. And so I was really interested in thinking about his example. And I would not for a second think that he's a scientific saint. In fact, Galileo had a lot of human characteristics about him, but that's part of the reason I liked him, and liked him as a sort of central figure, was because he is so incredibly human. So I started interviewing other researchers around the country and met many people who had been through a lot of hell because they had dared to put forth ideas that were upsetting to identity politics groups. I can give you just a couple of examples, though there are many more in the book. One is what happened to two researchers who were looking at the question of where sexual coercion and rape come from. And these researchers were Craig Palmer and Randy Thornhill, two anthropologists and biologists, who were looking at the feminist standard claim by that point that rape is about power, not about sex. Now, feminists had done enormous amounts of good in the world by trying to reshape, and did so successfully, reshaping our understanding of what rape is. Before the work of people like Susan Brown Miller, what we had was a system of prosecution of rape that was lazy, that blamed the victim, that saw the victim really as the person who had to defend herself. And so changing the dialogue about rape and talking about the ways in which rape were about power differentials rather than talking about it as a sexual event was really powerful and important and an incredibly useful change in terms of how rape was treated in America and worldwide. It was in that way similar to the way when transgender people started to desexualize talking about transgender that they made advancement too, because sex frankly distracts the human mind. And so if you can get humans to think more rationally by not being so distracted by the sexual element of a particular situation, you can move them forward. But what had happened for Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer was a dissatisfaction scientifically with the idea that rape was not about sex. And Randy was coming from the position of looking at sexual coercion in non-human animals. But Craig was really interested in looking at humans. So what had happened was Craig actually had been doing anthropology in graduate school at Arizona when the postmodern movement came in. And he told me when I did an interview with him that when everything in anthropology took the postmodern turn, he became really tired of it. He felt like if all we're going to do is say this is your narrative and that's your narrative, that's not science. So he actually dropped out of graduate school and he moved up to Maine and became a lobster fisherman. And he got a call one day from an assistant district attorney, and he was like, he told me, I thought, do I have a library book overdue? Why are they calling me? But this person was calling because there had been a kidnapping, rape, and murder of a girl in the neighborhood where Craig used to live. And the person calling him told him, we got the guy, we're sure did it, but we're calling you to find out if you're aware of any relationship between this guy and this girl in terms of did they know each other? Did they have any way of knowing each other? And Craig said, well, I didn't know either of them, but why would you have to prove for the prosecution that they knew each other? And the assistant district attorney explained that defense attorneys for rapists had been using the feminist line that rape is about power, not about sex. So you had to prove some reason why this guy would want power over this girl. And Craig said, but why couldn't you just explain that this was a opportunistic rape, right? He saw a girl, he kidnapped her, he raped her, and he murdered her to cover up the rape. But the assistant district attorney said, we're really going to have to try to be able to have some response to the claim that rape is about power, not about sex, when that comes before the jury. And so Craig was so upset by this idea that he asked his wife if it was okay with her if he went back to graduate school and studied rape in terms of thinking about rape as a sexual act. And she agreed to it, so he paid the bills in lobsters and went back to graduate school and did his dissertation on that and ended up teaming up with Randy for the book, A Natural History of Rape, which is a very challenging book because what it argues is that rape is not primarily about power in many cases. Rape is actually about lust, that it's about a sexual act and that some men are turned on by raping. Not all men by any means, and that's not to say that it's some sort of way to make the species stronger, but they do entertain the question, is it possible that if somebody is prone to sexual coercion, might he have a higher rate of reproductive fitness in terms of actually passing on more genes in terms of evolutionary history? So it was a very politically challenging book. What happened when their book came out was significant death threats. In fact, they told me about having to learn how to check for bombs wired under their cars. There were death threats left on their answering machines. They were given security instructions and basically extra security help. And what happened in the media was what I saw happen over and over again as I studied these cases, which is the media has a standard story in any given debate. And in the rape debate, the standard story is, if you don't say what the feminists say, which is rape is about power, not about sex, then what you're really saying is it was the woman's own fault, and it was how she was dressed, et cetera, et cetera. And so these guys immediately became apologists for rape, which they are not in the book. They're not apologists for rape. In fact, Craig was specifically motivated by the idea of trying to figure out how do we scientifically understand rape so that we can prevent it and prosecute it and help the victims better, so that we can actually help people. But what happened to them was a lot of hell. And I saw this as I interviewed other people as well. Just one other case that I'll mention briefly was the case of what happened to Napoleon Chagnon, a very famous anthropologist, at the hands of the American Anthropological Association, the AAA. In the 1960s, Chagnon and his colleague, the geneticist James Neal, were in the territory in South America inhabited by the Yanomama people, which is a group of people who had lived there for a very long time and were not reached by other people until relatively recently. And Chagnon and Neal were charged by a self-styled journalist named Patrick Tierney in a book called Darkness in El Dorado of having purposely caused an epidemic to occur from a measles vaccine. Supposedly that Neal had chosen a bad measles vaccine to spread among the Yanomama people so that he could run a eugenics-type experiment to see who would live and who would die. And what happened in 2000 when this work started to come out was that a bunch of liberal cultural anthropologists who didn't like Chagnon glommed onto this story and moved the AAA, the American Anthropological Association, to do a 2-year investigation of Chagnon, an ethics investigation, to try to see whether or not these claims were true. Neal was dead by that point, and he wasn't an anthropologist, so he was not subject to the prosecution of the AAA. And I ended up, again, spending an entire year looking at that story because that story struck me as one as being particularly creepy and insidious The majority of the harmful activism done in that case, although again, as in so many of these cases, done with absolutely good intentions, in that case, what ended up happening was I found that the leaders of the ethics investigation at the AAA knew full well that Tierney's book was false, that it was full of falsehoods. But they decided to proceed forward anyway because they decided that they had to look like they cared about indigenous people in order to signal that cultural anthropologists should be accepted around the world as advocates for indigenous people. So they went after Chagnon, easy to go after because he's a white, straight, male, bombastic, beer-drinking, swearing guy. He and I actually get along great, although we fight all the time, but he doesn't care and I don't care about that. But what ended up happening was they went after him and made his reputation basically get dragged through the mud for 2 years, in spite of the fact that they knew that this book was full of falsehoods. That case to me was, again, especially creepy because it showed to me the rot from within academia, the point to which some people would be willing to have their ideologies, their political missions, be first and foremost before looking at the facts. And there were absolutely good scientists within the AAA who tried hard, very hard, to fight for the facts, who were using evidence that was readily available, tapes, videos, firsthand testimony of what had really happened at the time. But it was incredibly difficult for them to turn it around because of so much grandstanding around the politics. So as I looked around academia, and as this book was published now a year and a half ago, what we see are numerous examples of this kind of stuff happening, and I feel very strongly that it's important that we protect academia from having a system in which we let our politics simply rule what we believe to be true, and maybe even in terms of ruling what we even decide to research. What we see increasingly today is well-meaning shutdowns of conversations among leftists, and I identify as leftist, but among leftist faculty, but also students, who feel that certain types of traditional literature that has been taught or types of conversations that happen should not be allowed to happen because they are offensive and marginalizing to historically oppressed groups. And this kind of work, although I'm sympathetic to it because heaven knows it has been a long time for a lot of people who've been marginalized to finally come into the classroom in a big way and come into the academy in a big way. I think this is an ahistorical attitude that does not fully appreciate how dangerous it is to insist that people can't have ideas that are offensive, research projects that are so-called dangerous, and conversations that are deeply uncomfortable. I try to explain to those people frequently that if they don't allow that kind of stuff, then the kinds of work I've done for 20 years would not be allowed. And I'll tell you briefly about how the kind of work I do is no longer allowed in certain ways. But it's not just activists who are allowing themselves to be led by ideology. I also see people on the science side of things led by ideology in ways that I think is sloppy and requires a lot more attention. And I'll just give you one example. If you follow me on Twitter at all, you'll see that I'm in a big heated argument right now about vaccines. I'm very pro-vaccines that have been shown to be necessary, safe, and effective, which are the vaccines that are in general use in terms of the population in America. But one of the things that's happened is because there's a big anti-vaccination movement in this country that's pretty dangerous and pretty powerful, the scientists and the people who are the advocates for vaccines have entrenched and have decided they'll make all sorts of exceptions on things they wouldn't normally make exceptions for because vaccine pushing is too important to use the usual systems. So I'll give you just one example. Probably the most famous ethicist in the country, and certainly maybe even in the world, is Arthur Caplan, who's now at New York University. You probably have heard of Art Caplan, seen him on TV, read his columns. Art Caplan pushes vaccines heavily. He pushes, for example, the flu vaccine. He pushes the HPV vaccine. He pushes the MMR vaccine, all of which have been shown to be safe and effective with maybe the exception of the flu vaccine, which is safe, but unfortunately not as effective as we would like. And one of the things he does is he never discloses that he takes money from vaccine makers. Most vaccine makers are, in fact, the same pharmaceutical companies that you'll see in the news because they've done something unethical or illegal. These are not special holy companies that suddenly forget the profit motive when they come to vaccines. These are companies that spend money on vaccines just like they spend money on other drugs to try to make sure they get used because that's where the profits come from. Now, again, my feeling is vaccines are important for public health. We should encourage people strongly to use them. We should encourage people to understand the science behind it. But I really firmly believe that if you're going to push vaccines in the public eye, in order to keep the view of vaccines safe, you should disclose if you're taking money from the vaccine makers. In fact, I would rather you not even weigh in on the subject, because I think having people who take money from vaccine makers weigh in on the subject leads to cynicism. There are plenty of people like me who take no money from the vaccine industry and are happy to push the importance of certain vaccines on the public. When I've tried to get Kaplan to disclose, whether he's writing for the mainstream press or he's writing for the medical literature, that he takes money from the vaccine makers, what he says to me is that because the checks are written to his center and they're not written personally to him, he doesn't need to disclose them. His center, if you look at it, it's called the Center for Vaccine Ethics and Policy. Makes me kind of gag. The policy part is true, the ethics part, It actually openly solicits business from the vaccine industry. They offer to write peer-reviewed papers for the vaccine industry. They offer to do positioning in the public realm. They offer to do marketing work, basically, for vaccine makers, and yet nowhere does he disclose that. And why do I object to it? Because ultimately the people who are anti-vax end up feeling like that's the kind of nasty thing that goes on that's causing vaccines to be pushed even when they're not necessarily safe and effective. It causes cynicism that is dangerous to the public health. But what I have found in academia is I've been told over and over again, shut up, Alice. Don't talk about the corruption. Don't talk about the money taking within the vaccine system, because if you talk about that, you're going to feed the anti-vaxxers. And I'm busy telling them, you cannot make exceptions in terms of the science and the ethics where this is concerned, because as soon as we begin to make exceptions on anything, we lose our credibility, we lose our integrity. But I'll tell you right now, I'm battling another round of shut up, Alice. So why should we try to save academia? Why should we bother to try to be pure? Why should we be the place that tries to do the search for truth in a way that is ethically pure, that is not polluted with conflicts of interest where money is concerned, that tries really hard to look at facts that make us deeply uncomfortable? Well, again, what I would do is bring it home to where I started and say to you, academia is the last place in this country where we have people who maybe have the kinds of protections they need to challenge the claims of the automotive industry, to look at what government is really doing. If you look at the Flint water crisis, what you see is the people who managed to finally tip it to stop the government from covering it up were academics. Academics at Michigan State University and Virginia Tech, land-grant public universities. If you look at where people are fighting the kinds of lies that are put out in some circumstances in studies by drug companies, those are people within academia who are working hard to try to figure out what's true. The same thing with regard to agricultural systems, the same thing with regard to social policy. Our national system depends on having a place where research can be safe and where the teaching of looking at facts can be safe. But right now, what I would say to you is that we have a very dangerous situation on our hands. We have a three-pronged attack occurring on academia. The one prong is coming from moneyed right-of-center individuals, including, in many cases, Republican governors and Republican legislatures. So we see a situation, for example, in Wisconsin, where the University of Wisconsin system's tenure system is being dismantled as we know it under Scott Walker, because he wants to have the ability to install trustees who can decide which programs need to go. So there is in Wisconsin, for example, a state senator who has decided he doesn't like one reading in one course and he wants to see part of the university defunded because he doesn't like one reading in one course. It happens to be a reading about gay life. We see in North Carolina, Gene Nichols, who's a very, very esteemed, very well-established legal scholar, he had a center on poverty which studied the question of where does poverty come from and how does it harm people and how can we try to deal with it. The Republican legislature in North Carolina shut down his center on poverty because they didn't like the ways in which it was challenging him politically. We're seeing the Koch brothers and similar groups investing large amounts of money into academic systems to try to regain control of what gets taught. But at the same time, within the academic systems, we see this sort of well-meaning but very problematic attacks from the left, in which Title IX is often being used to shut down discussions of things that make some people uncomfortable, in which I'm hearing from women like me who are feminist, long-term LGBT advocates being told in their classrooms by students who believe themselves to be left of them, that they should not be teaching this text or that text because it's offensive or triggering. So we're seeing these kinds of deeply worrying attacks that are well-meaning from the left as well. And then I think what is the most scary and problematic, because it draws the power from both of these sides and comes down on us hard, and that's the corporatization of our universities. I'm sure many of you who have lived in universities as long as I have for 20 years have seen this, but what we see today is that students are talked about as if they are customers. Faculty are treated as if we are salespeople on commission. And what are we judged on? We're no longer even judged on publications. We're not judged on production of knowledge. What are we judged on? External funding. We're judged on how much money we bring in. We're judged like we're car salesmen. And what you have is the donors to the university being treated like they're corporate shareholders. And you can never offend the corporate shareholders because, frankly, they'll get the university president fired. And so you have the bringing in of university presidents who are not academics, who have no background in research and teaching, who are coming out of business systems, running systems that basically are run like corporations, where if you cross them, you will be crushed, where there is not a valuing of open dialogue, where there is shameless branding. So today, when I get notices from my local university about what's going on in terms of, we did this research project or that research, it doesn't come from media relations. It comes from the Department of Media Relations and Branding. It literally says that on it. And to close, I'll just tell you the story of my own situation, why I ended up leaving Northwestern. You can't make this stuff up. At one point, somebody said to me, my book should be called You Can't Make This Up. It probably would have been better because Galileo's middle finger freaks some people out as a title. In fact, I had a person introducing me a couple months ago who was very shy, and he introduced my book as Galileo's Third Digit. So what happened to me at Northwestern was I was working there as a full professor. I'd been promoted to a full professor, teaching my history of medicine class. I was asked to be next in line to edit our internal journal/magazine, which went around the world in medical humanities and bioethics. So I was in the program for medical humanities and bioethics. And this was the journal Atrium. And Atrium was this very edgy, high production, beautiful, incredibly interesting, I called it a topist journal. It was short pieces, usually not more than about 2,000 words long, often shorter, a lot of graphic art, all centered around a theme within medical humanities or bioethics, usually medical humanities. So some of the themes we had were graphic or the liminal, medical humanities kind of stuff. And what would happen is we'd put out a call for proposals, and doctors and nurses and social workers and medical historians and philosophers and patients would propose to contribute to that theme. I was given the theme Bad Girls, which I didn't come up with, but I loved, because I thought it really captured this sort of question of who counts as bad, who counts as a girl. The term girl is very loaded, the term bad is very loaded, so it was great. So we put together, as we always did, a call for proposals, sent it out. I got about 33, 35 proposals back. Out of that, I could pick about 13. So I picked 13 that I thought would make me very uncomfortable, because I feel like that's my job, right, as a medical humanities person, is to make us uncomfortable around medicine, get us to think about how do we do better. So one of the pieces that was sent to me, actually I really thought the abortion pieces were going to be the ones that got me in trouble, but one of the pieces that was sent to me by an anthropologist at Syracuse University, a cultural anthropologist, Bill Peace, and Bill does disability studies. Bill wrote about how he was spinal cord injured at the age of 18. He had a progressive neurological disease, and he was writing about what happened to him at the age of 18 in 1978 in a rehabilitation hospital. And what he wrote about was how nobody would answer his questions about his sex life. He was trying to figure out, am I going to be able to have sex? Am I going to be able to be a father someday? And none of his questions were being answered. And this is the time of the sexual revolution, right? So sex is out in the open. And at that time, rehabilitation medicine meant you were in rehab for a very long time inpatient. And that meant that you got very friendly with the staff. And so he tells the story of how one particular nurse with whom he had a close relationship one day consensually gave him oral sex in order to reassure him that his function still worked, that he would be able to ejaculate, that he would someday be able to have a child, and that his sex life was going to work. It was going to be fine. And he told the story about what a compassionate thing it was, and he was very clear that he was not advocating that this is what should happen in medicine, but he was raising the question, are we today taking care of the needs of people with disabilities in terms of answering their sexual questions and dealing with their real sexual lives? Well, I published this piece, which went through the usual system of my colleagues reading it. And the piece went, 3,000 copies of the journal went out like it always did. It went up online. And one day I was called in and told that the dean of our medical school, who had been brought in to sell our medical school essentially to the hospital corporation, which he had successfully done, Dean Eric Nielsen, had decided that this piece violated a branding agreement with the hospital corporation, and it would therefore be withdrawn, censored. It was already published. It was fully published, but he decided that because it violated a branding agreement, he was going to withdraw it. I had a book coming out called Galileo's Middle Finger, which is all about academic freedom and standing up against censorship. And so I said to them, you've got to be kidding me. Like, this is so bizarre that this would happen just as I'm proofreading this book and lawyering this book and sending it to press. And I was told, be quiet, don't say anything. We know it's hard for you, but don't say anything. We're going to try to fix this internally. But what made it much more horrifying was that Dean Nielsen decided that if Atrium was going to continue as a journal, there would be a new editorial committee consisting of the dean's office and the PR department, which would decide what we could publish. And we would no longer be allowed to publish anything that was off-brand. Can you imagine anything more chilling? I mean, how could I possibly work in an institution like that? So after about 15 months of this, one of my colleagues quit over it. My colleague, Christie Kirchner, who is a physician who does rehabilitation medicine but also does disability studies, she had published a piece in the same issue about women with disabilities and how their sexuality is really not visible and not seen. She quit. I went into the dean's office and I said, how can you do this? Like, how can you tell me that you're entitled to decide what we publish? And their answer was, well, we paid for it. And I said to them, but you fund all of my research. At some level, all of my work is paid for you. Am I supposed to check everything I write with you? And they wouldn't answer my question. I showed them the cover to the book, which had blurbs from Jared Diamond, E.O. Wilson, Dan Savage, Steve Pinker, and I said, if you read these blurbs, you'll see it all praises me for doing work on academic freedom and for pushing. How can you do this as this book is coming out? And all they would say to me was, congratulations on your book. They told me I could go to Evanston and try, but that I would run into the same thing. I did go to Evanston. I talked to the provost, Dan Linzer, and I appealed to him to undo the censorship, remove the censorship committee, as we called it, restore it, and admit that there had been censorship and assure me it would not happen again, and they refused to do that. So I resigned from Northwestern University last year because I cannot work in a place that does that to people. So what's happening in terms of the corporatization is what we are seeing is a situation where university administrations are operating under a brand model, and they are using the enthusiasm of the left to shut things down as an excuse to shut down people they are worried are going to make people uncomfortable. They are using the money that's pouring in from the right as a reason to use that as kind of a club on us to say, well, you cost a lot of money, and here's some people who have money, and they're going to help us decide which programs exist. And what we have is a situation like nothing we've ever had before, but that looks increasingly like what Galileo had in terms of the people on the top deciding what kinds of research will be done, what kind of teaching will be done, and therefore what kind of truth will get out there. And I'm not saying all university administrators are evil. Most of them aren't. I sleep with one now. The guy I married as a doctor is now the dean of the medical school at Michigan State and dealing with the Flint water crisis. So there are lots of good people within university administrations, but I think unless those of us who are students and faculty and academic staff within universities begin to wake up and begin to recognize the kinds of structural changes that are occurring and take action, what we're going to end up with is a vastly weakened research system, a pathetic teaching system, and a situation where ultimately American democracy suffers, where we have people who are graduating without really knowing how to think, how to be aware of what's around them, how to be uncomfortable, who won't understand the thing one of my professors so importantly told me in graduate school when I was stuck on an ideology. He said to me, Alice, if you haven't changed your mind lately, how do you know it's working? And that is the thing that I think we should aspire to, right? The question, if I haven't changed my mind lately, what's the evidence to me that it's really working? We have something greater than our own problems to deal with, although our problems within the academic system are great. We have the problems of American democracy in front of us. And if we are going to keep going forward in the ways that the Founding Fathers set us up beautifully to do, to pursue truth and to pursue justice, we are going to have to fight really hard. And we're going to have to build alliances across disciplines that don't normally talk to each other and across political groups that don't normally get along. But there's a really good reason to do it, and that's that it is way too soon to end the Enlightenment. Thank you. Sally told me that sometimes it takes a while for questions to get going, but I said, don't worry. With this talk, usually it doesn't take too long. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I have a question. So you say it's time for some of us to wake up and realize this challenge to the institution. And there's some of us that really believe in the Enlightenment project, right? But as either junior faculty or even just TAs, we see that even people in better positions cannot fight this wave, right? And so I was wondering, what is the kind of advice that you would give for us that want to still sort of, fight for this Enlightenment project, but don't really know how to with this tide, right? This tidal wave that's overcoming.
Every university has its own local issues around which people can join. And I'm sure you have some, but let me suggest that if you don't have a particular one facing you immediately, that what you consider doing is looking at a document called the Chicago Principles, which were put out by the University of Chicago. That is a statement about how the goal of the university is not to have a single message or for the administration to decide what it is we're supposed to be thinking about or talking about. The goal is to be diverse in terms of concepts and to have uncomfortable conversations together. It's a beautiful document put out by the University of Chicago. It's available through the website of the FIRE Foundation, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. And if you look up Chicago Principles and FIRE, you'll find this document. Work with people across your campus who are like-minded. Build alliances across disciplines and across the political spectrum, which I realize in universities is only about this wide anyway. And see if you can get the university's governance system, whatever that is, the faculty in particular, to pass some version of that in which you come to a mutual agreement that it is not up to the administration to decide what is true. If you can do that, that document begins to become available to you when people are being silenced or people are being intimidated. And it's a very useful thing to do. Now, over dinner, we also discussed the fact that you're facing guns coming into your university. This strikes me, what we always say is there's nothing like a common enemy. Your common enemy is armed, even better, right? So you have a situation where if a lot of you are motivated around the idea that universities need to be, in a sense, a sacred place in terms of people being physically safe to be together, and you feel that guns are not going to be able to be part of that, then I would say find ways to build alliances across that begin to create a system of power from below that challenges the corporate model, that challenges the idea that the university's system can be determined by your state legislature. I recognize you're in the same situation we are, where you're up against a tough state legislature. But until we start actively fighting that and begin to really motivate ourselves against it, we're facing things like Wisconsin is facing, where basically the system is being dismantled. University of Wisconsin, as you know, is one of the best university systems in the world, and it is being actively dismantled in very frightening ways. So I know it can be hard, but the other thing I would say to you is I know you're in a vulnerable position, but I've been in a vulnerable position most of my life. And granted, I'm married a doctor, so that helps economically. But there's a lot of work that you can do even though you're in a vulnerable position, as long as you maintain integrity and do the kind of work that has integrity and build relationships with people. Don't treat people as the enemy. Sit down with them, meet with them. And I'll bet you a lot of administrators are feeling the same angst that you are. I certainly find that frequently administrators come to my talks and call me afterwards and say, can we talk for an hour? Because they're uncomfortable with what's happening in the university systems. Some of them did grow up in the university system and are really worried. Yes?
Thank you so much for your talk. There's a lot to think about. And one thing I kind of wanted to ask you is, you named a few different sort of drivers of some of this activity that you've sort of summarized. So on the one hand, you named sort of formerly marginalized groups kind of coming into the academy and finding a space where they can articulate their own kind of interests. You also named right-wing legislatures trying to control what's taught in universities from the opposite end of the political spectrum. Then you kind of ended on the corporatization of the university. And I'm a Marxist, so I don't really have a problem with that, but like I'm kind of wondering if you think that there's something that kind of ties all of those things together and other things, if there's some kind of, what is driving this sort of general trend? Because it seems to me that this trend is also one that has a kind of periodicity to it. So a lot of what you talked about reminded me of, say, official state ideology in communist states in, the mid-20th century, but also McCarthyism and even,
Absolutely.
The Salem witch trials, right,
Yep.
which Arthur Miller used as an allegory for McCarthyism. So is there something that kind of, like something cyclical or something that kind of ties these things together so that there's kind of a, sort of an outbreak of this sort of desire to kind of clamp down on, intellectual freedom, let's say, from time to time, or is it just kind of a random confluence of events?
As a historian, I would say there's so many causes coming into it, but one thing that's going on, right, is historical amnesia. That what we find is that young people today are not educated about what happened during the McCarthy era. So my son, for example, who's 16 and in a very good high school, they spent 10 minutes in his class on McCarthy. Not enough for anybody to really understand what that history was about. And to me, that was one of the most important moments in American history, right? Where basically what you had is a moment that could have gone either way, but that some really decent people finally had enough and stood up and decided to change things. And it was also an important moment because it was not a moment at which an identity group moved forward, which is important, but it was really a movement on principles, which only occurs a few times historically, where people are deeply moved on a fundamental principle. Most of the time you get manifestations of principles. So the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement, those are manifestations of a principle. But in the McCarthy system, that was an actual principle being mobilized in a really important way. So I think that part of what's going on with the cycles is historical amnesia. But why are we seeing this all today? It has to do with the ways in which academia is powerless and therefore easy to take over, right? So if you have a situation where there's a place with a lot of value but not a lot of power, that's a place where a lot of people are going to move in and try to take over. And that's what we see happening. And social media today makes it possible for anybody who wants power to have far more of it than they really should. I certainly saw that with the live tweeting of my son's sex ed class, which was, not planned. I went in and there was this ridiculous class being taught, and so I started tweeting it, and suddenly it was all over the world, and it changed a lot of conversations around the world, but it also finally changed the lousy sex ed teaching in my son's class that I didn't realize was going on. But it was kind of bizarre to me how 45 minutes of texting caused this huge national thing to happen when a project I didn't even mention to you that makes up the last third of my book that I spent 3 years on researching an abusive experimentation on fetuses to try to do sexual engineering in which families were used without their consent in an experiment. I mean, it's a horrifying story I didn't even mention. 3 years of my life on that and almost nobody knows about it, right? Why? Because I can't tweet it in 140 characters. So social media is part of the reason we're seeing what's going on. And as much as possible, I think trying to think about the ways in which social media can be used for good and then left at times and not used when it's time to actually talk to each other is really important. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eric, and I'm the son of 2 Nigerian immigrants.
Hi, Eric.
And my parents loved this country because of the story that they were told, as in this is the place where you can express your ideas, your ideologies freely. But as I've come to learn, and also them, it's not true that everything is value-free and that you can't have anything not be colored by your own ideas. And so I'm interested in how do you get people to be being uncomfortable, because I don't know if that's fair to ask people who are afraid of their own survival to sort of open up to new ideas. The story that I like so much about America is nice for me, but it might not be for someone else. And so I'm really interested in how you can get a group of people, a large group of people, to sort of accept new ideas comfortably.
They're not going to accept them comfortably. I think part of what we have to think about is the duty that we have to each other to exist in spaces that are uncomfortable. And maybe part of the reason that we no longer do that is because of the fact that medicine has, and I mean, I'm speaking my bias here, right, a historian of medicine. Medicine has managed to take away from us a lot of the physically uncomfortable moments that humans used to have to share together. Birth, death, suffering, illness. Medicine has solved a lot of that. And as a consequence, humans have become less comfortable with disability, with death, with blood, frankly, with the kinds of things that humans used to be forced to do together. I think we have to force ourselves to think about ways in which it is a moral duty to spend time sometimes in spaces that challenge where you are if you're going to be in a country that's a pluralistic democracy. That's one of the things my parents absolutely valued, was the idea that they stuck us all the time in situations where we were profoundly uncomfortable, because their attitude was, you need to learn how to exist in New York, in the sense that New York, is where I grew up, but it was a part of the world. And my mother's attitude was, you're not going to grow up and be a stupid, ugly American, right, who has this concept of whatever you've had within 1 mile of your home is the best thing in the universe. You have to learn to try different things, go into different spaces, learn different things, and argue. And part of what we're not doing in classes right now, because I know faculty are often afraid, is helping students understand how to argue. One of the things that faculty can do that can be very productive is to reward discord. I know that sounds weird, but humans are animals, and they respond to reward and punishment. One of the things that I found extremely productive in my own teaching was to reward students when they had a meaningful argument with me, or they specifically responded to other students. So in my own history of medicine class, for example, I had a built-in component. Now I was dealing with students who all wanted A's, because these are medical students, which was great, because you can motivate them to do anything if they wanted an A. And one of the things I did was absolutely require them to engage in critical conversation with their classmates in order to get the grade that they wanted to get. And that meant they had to have a constructive argument with somebody else in the room. That was extremely productive, because it meant they had to find a place where they might actually disagree, and then they would go to that place and try to develop an argument around it, and it was extremely productive. But I think what's happening right now is a lot of faculty are afraid to have any discord in the classroom because of the feeling that students who feel uncomfortable will report the classroom as an unsafe place. Safe spaces came out of a really good place. Those of you who were around 20 years ago and doing LGBT work may know where safe spaces came out of. The idea was that we would be specially trained, and we would have a sticker on our office door that indicated that we had been specially trained to be a person who could be talked to by a student who might be in a sexual minority, so that they could talk to us safely. And what that allowed was for the student to easily recognize which professors were going to be safe to come out to and to talk to and try to get resources through. So they could come in and it would look like a typical office hour, they'd close the door, and then they'd talk to you. And you were trained, where could you send them for the resources they needed? If they were feeling depressed or suicidal, where could you immediately make sure that they were going to get help? Where could you find out where they could get health resources? Where could they get a peer support group? That's what safe spaces were. They were closed door offices where we were specially trained to deal with the kinds of struggles our students were facing. Today, what I find is people talk sometimes about classrooms being safe spaces, and they're talking about dealing with students with trigger warnings. Actual trigger warnings are real mental health issues. Faculty are not trained to deal with them. If you're actually dealing with somebody who has a legitimate trigger for PTSD, you're in over your head if you don't have mental health training. What you should be doing is being called by the Office of Disability Studies, because that student should have already gone to the Office of Disability Studies, and had somebody work with them to let the professor know that there's a particular trigger that might occur, so that that professor can work with that accommodation. You do a legitimate disability accommodation, and you are trained to find out if a student does begin to have a PTSD, what are your duties in terms of the medical care that you need to make sure you get right away for that student. So what's happened is this sort of dumbing down of the concept of the safe space and dumbing down of the concept of PTSD and the trigger warning that is leaving people who legitimately need that kind of stuff having nowhere to go. Instead, we have a concept that we're supposed to all be kind of friendly and not offend anybody. That's not a productive place for us to be. Sometimes we're going to offend each other. Sometimes we're going to make each other uncomfortable. That's part of why we come to a university.
So to be clear, it's our moral duty to be uncomfortable.
Not every second of the day, but if you want to be a participating member of a pluralistic democracy, yes.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned that because of identity politics, a lot of the work you've been doing for the past 20 years could not be done now. Could you elaborate on that?
So one of the things I did, right, was publish a piece that was actively censored. And that is one example. But I would also say that when I started teaching at Michigan State 20 years ago, my students were terrified of talking about LGBT stuff. They were absolutely terrified. In fact, I had one student in the classroom who was very openly gay, who had rainbow stickers all over his backpack, and always talked very positively about LGBT stuff. And one day in class, he mentioned his boyfriend, and the whole room gasped. And I said to him afterwards, Michael, apparently you came out today. And to me, he had been like very clearly out. And he said, I know, well, you know how this culture is. You're presumed straight unless absolutely proven gay. And that's what he was experiencing. But in that classroom, I was doing stuff with students where I was asking them not to tell me about their sex lives, but to write in their class journals about thinking about how does what we're reading today impact the way I'm thinking about my own head in terms of how am I thinking about this stuff. I would do things like demonstrate birth in the two positions it's typically done, either the squatting position or the lithotomy position, because I was teaching the history of birth, and I would get up on a table and demonstrate birth in the lithotomy position versus birth in the squatting position. Today, I honestly think I might be charged with sexual harassment because I'm demonstrating birth. I mean, this stuff did start to move in early on. I have to say, the first sexual harassment policy that came around in Michigan State, when it came, it was absolutely ridiculous. It said things like, you're never allowed to show pictures of genitals in the classroom. Well, I was teaching sex development. I was like, I really need to show pictures of genitals in the classroom. These kids have had lousy sex education, and now I have to do it, right? So what I did was I took my syllabus and I took the sex harassment policy, and I circled the places in the sexual harassment policy and pointed to where in my syllabus I was going to violate it. I really did. I explained to my chair, I'm going to violate the sexual harassment policy in the following 9 ways during this week, this week, this week, this week, this week. He was like, gotcha. And I went and did it, right? But today I would be absolutely terrified of doing that because it is so much easier today for universities to fire you if you violate what their interpretation of Title IX is, if you violate their interpretation of what counts as sexual harassment, those kinds of things that I think are really much more dangerous today. That, and frankly, today, all the pressure, and I saw it at Northwestern, is to get external funding. And the kind of work I do in the humanities is cheap and doesn't require any external funding. But I had so much pressure put on me at Northwestern to go and get external funding to fund my research, and I kept telling him, I don't need external funding. I use a library and a computer and a tape recorder, right? Like, I don't need any external funding. But that's the kind of stuff that would create huge amounts of pressure on me that made it very difficult for me to do my work, and that very much pressured me to do the kind of work that could get external funding, which frankly was very safe, very politically timid work compared to the kind of work I normally do. You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Rose, and I want to put out there that we're not taught how to talk to each other, and there should be classes on how to verbalize what you want to say in an appropriate way so that you're speaking from your heart and you're not, trying to put the other person down. You're just trying to understand what the other person is saying and so forth. And I know there's several books out there, but the one that I can remember is by Marshall Rosenberg, Nonviolent Communication. And I can remember Marshall Rosenberg because I think of a Marshall's badge and an iceberg covered with roses.
It's a great image.
So that's one, but there's a lot better ones than that, but I'd like to see that in the classrooms.
Yeah, certainly modeling of communication is something that we're not doing enough, that we certainly need to spend more time on. It's hard to live in the world, and it's especially hard to live in a world that's an internet world, because the temptation to be on your phone looking down, dealing with the part of the universe you want to deal with is very high. But I really do want to encourage all of you to recognize that we're in a historical moment where the presidential election that we're looking at, with the climate change situation we're looking at, with all of the kinds of political struggles that are going on today, that there's a real role for us as scholars and as teachers and as learners that is much bigger than ourselves. And if we begin to think of that work as incredibly important service work that is following up on the basis that was laid down for us by so many people who did heroic, selfless, unpaid work, there's a lot of good to be done. And the good news is psychological research will tell you doing good in the world leaves you feeling pretty good. Thanks all for coming.